So it's really, really a pleasure to be here today. And it is all about a moonshot. And I'm going to challenge you all to actually work with me on solving for really billion people problems. So when I look at building a humanized internet, tell me what you think. What are you thinking when I say humanized internet? Somebody, shout it out. Accessible. And?
Wearable tech.
Wearable tech. Good girl. And? Love it, love it. Let me tell you, here's what I'm thinking, and this is all very, very valid. This is a subset of a presentation I made at the UN on May 20th of this year. And I want you to think about what's happening in this world. And if there's one takeaway, that takeaway is there's going to be a human in the loop. One takeaway. And there's certain qualities of that human that we need to care about, right? So humanized. So let's think about what's happening in the world today. What's happening in the world right now is that we're probably in the greatest migration we've seen of people since World War II. We probably are. And by the way, I'm in Region 8. That means I'm in Europe. I am a US citizen living abroad, so I have a green card in reverse. And in between, I lived in Hong Kong. So I've seen the world around me. So what you have is migrations of people. You also have a challenge to the systems that we've created. The systems, whether they are identity, and I'm going to challenge you here. Identity is really, really, really important. Think about identity and digital identity. Think about the implications of privacy. And when I say digital identity, I mean I choose to share with you what I want to share and when I want to share it. Okay? So we have migration, we have lots of things happening, and Vint actually and I have been talking about this problem, Vint Cerf from yesterday. Think about connecting the next 2 to 3 billion people in the next several years. And by the way, they're not coming from North America, ladies and gentlemen. They are not coming from North America. They are not coming from Europe. They're coming from other parts of the world. Other parts of the world. So that gives us a chance to think about how we're creatively going to solve for big problems. The other notion here, when we think about this whole notion of migration, so migration, what's happening in this world, what are the factors that we have to care about? How many of you know foreign languages? Good. Know foreign languages. That's real important. How many of you have a degree in other degrees, like than science and engineering? Anthropology, creative writing, being able to think deeply. This is really, really important because I want to talk about the skill sets. So, one is to think about the ability to take your science, your engineering, and apply it very, very deeply, but see a broader world. The other side of it is tech policy implications. A lot of what I do is around the UN level. What are the tech policy implications of the work we do, of the engineering that you do? You have some notion of representation of government, so you have to take a look at that. There is a lady who is an Intel fellow. Her name is Geneviève Bell. How many of you have heard of her? Geneviève has a PhD in anthropology. She has a PhD in anthropology from Stanford. She's a daughter of an anthropologist. She comes from Australia, and by the way, was raised in Aborigine communities and speaks several Aborigine dialects. And so when she sees the world differently. She sees it from an anthropological lens. Now, one of the people whose name is up here happens to be a refugee. And his status happens to be refugee. But he does not want to be known as a refugee. He wants to be known as an engineer. He wants to be known as a technologist. And so it's very interesting when you start to see the world collapsing as we are seeing, the implications that we have today. So I'm going to talk to you about building that humanized internet, and with it, some background. some background that's happening, whether you're paying attention, and you need to pay attention. People say, you know, all of what's happening around me is just happening, but you need to pay attention to geopolitical factors. You need to pay attention to that, ladies and gentlemen. You need to understand your geography. You need to be able to understand that the world is not always going to speak English. All right? And that we have big moonshot problems that we need to solve. And perhaps we can learn from the other side. Some people call that, you know, reverse innovation. And I will say innovation is a state of mind. Entrepreneurship is a state of your mind. So when I talk about that, let me take a step back. I was actually in a conference in Abu Dhabi last year. And with me was a lady from Kenya. She's a physicist. She works with the government, and she's a poet at heart. That's the way she describes herself. I'm a physicist, I'm a poet at heart. We had a wonderful panel about women leading in this world and what it means and how we can do great stuff together. After the panel, this is when you get into ethnocentric behavior. After the panel, a person came up to her, gave him his business card, and said, "I think I can help you." And she nodded in disgust and said, "You know, it would be the other way. Perhaps he needs my help. Perhaps he needs my help." So let's take a look about the world around us. We are living, as you probably very well know, in a hyper-connected world. Everything is becoming very small and very, very powerful. Very small and very powerful. Vint gave you an idea of that yesterday when he was talking about that big, heavy mobile phone. And now it's smaller and smaller and smaller. And to wearables, I think we have a great challenge here. We need to think about making wearables a little less intrusive, but interesting. You know? So think about that for a minute. And I'll tell you why. Let me take a step back. How many of you studied Roman history? This is really great for you. Great, fantastic. We got it. So if you remember in Roman history, and how many of you seen the film The Devil Wears Prada or something? Yeah, cool, right, fantastic. Do you remember the scene where Meryl Streep is walking, and there are two people beside her, left and right, and there's a person coming before her, a couple. She's going, "Who are these people? Who are these people? Who are these people?" And somebody whispered in her ear, "It's so-and-so, that's the ambassador, his wife, and you need to understand their history." Well, in Roman history, you had the emperor who had what he called nomenclators, left and right. Who are these people? Who are these people? And let me just say there's some work being done in research to think about how I capture my history with you without wearing the glasses. You know, have you ever met somebody who said, who are you, right? Who are you? So that's an interesting thing. So functionality. There's also, God almighty, I've seen this picture before. I hate to tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, but I worked in the punch card days. How many of you have done that? Oh my goodness, I know. Well, for you it's all in museums, but I can tell you that it's very interesting. But we are going down lots of functionality, from mainframe to smart environments to environments that are smart. So my light bulb can probably have a DDoS attack to your home, and that has actually happened, by the way. And so we think about this hyper-connected world that is so human, but we have to remember that there is a humanized internet involved in it. Now, Vint calls it, I'm working with Vint and a group, we call it the people's internet. And you would think, well, it's always been the people's internet. But it is the people's internet. Now, my role in the UN, for example, activities, what we're seeing is a dangerous cooptation of that internet, where there is no longer a freedom of service. And so we need to think about, people who were involved in the Arab Spring Rising, or who were involved in those types of rising, what it meant for them to have that internet or be able to tweet. And that Twitter is being shut down in a lot of countries. So we have this hyper-humanized, everything is happening, And by the way, it affects all of us, world, right? All of us, world. Smart and connected. How many are you wearing a smartwatch? Okay. Well, think about that. Think about how much information you're pulsating out. Think about that. Now, the reason I ask you to think about privacy also, there's this very strong, I'm wearing one too, there's this very strong divide between, connectivity, and also what you pulsate out. And such that you become sort of this walking human network. We've talked about that, bio-networking, human factors networking. I think that one of the things that we have to, when I say privacy, remember one thing, I live on the other side of the world. And so how many of you are from Germany? So if you are from Germany, the most strictest laws of privacy are there. It's called data governance. Understand that world very much. And why is that? It's what happened in World War II under the Nazis. Because they kept strong records of people. They knew where they were at any time, any place, and guess what? It was horrific, and they don't want to live through that again. So there's a lot of areas around privacy engineering, privacy by design, understand that world. So it's a really big dialectic here. And I'm painting a world for you because I'm talking about digital identity a bit. Digital identity. I think we know, we've seen this picture before. We've seen this picture in terms of the phases of technology that were alluded to yesterday, about the car, about putting people on the moon, even going now to Mars. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. But if you take a step back for 1 minute, what are the implications of everything being connected? Do we isolate ourselves in our communities? Do we isolate ourselves in our homes? What are the ethical responsibilities that we have in technology? This is a challenge to you. What are the ethical responsibilities? I have a very interesting colleague. His name is Rafael D'Andrea. How many of you have heard of Rafael D'Andrea? He is one of the top learning machine experts in the world. He's at the Technical University in Zurich, and also created Kiva, which runs Amazon's robots. And what Rafael and I talked about, Rafael said, Monique, I don't care about the ethics. I care as a theorist, as a scientist, that things will work. But I'm asking you whether or not you should. And by the way, Rafael privately is a Luddite. And in his home, he has no technology. But I'm thinking, should we? Should we care about it? You are all embarking on your careers, ladies and gentlemen. Some of you are still in college. Some of you are new in your career. Some of you maybe even mid-career. You need to think about these tough questions when we're looking at research. But it's a wonderful future. It's not dystopian. It's wonderful because we get to solve big problems. Remember? This is about the moonshine. So perhaps these are some of the traits we need to think about. There is the human in the loop. Who's using the internet? Who's using it? What do people have commonly? Even those people crossing the desert or the boats or coming into Greece, they have a phone, most part. What about having more participatory? What does participatory constructs look like? When we say we're going to connect the unconnected, and what does that mean? And what are we going to learn from that? Okay? And the other thing is, do we think, and this is the dialectic, that we'll have more free time. There's a theory that says we could, but there's also a theory that says people want to work. And so what does that mean, that dialectic, I want to work? What does work mean, right? And I'll take a step back. How many of you have done design thinking? D work. Design thinking is really important. Write it down. Design thinking may not be for everyone. And so here's the thing on design thinking. I was at a D-School event at the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Potsdam. And we were thrown in different teams. Different teams. We were 8 teams. I didn't know anybody in my team. They had eclectic backgrounds. University professors, scientists. One person was from the Deutsche Bank. One lady was from Dresden, small and medium businesses. That's what she cared about. And we came across a very interesting narrative about the world, which was very, very challenging. And the narrative was skill up or pay up. Skill up or pay up, which was really provocative. And it was, there's no analog to what we described. There were politicians in the audience. There was no analog at all. So, here is the narrative. And it becomes this whole notion of humanized. What does humanized mean? I'm a CEO. I have the right to refresh my talent. I take new talent in. I fire people. Take new talent in, fire people, but I'm not competitive. Something's happening. Something's happening. I'm not keeping up. Change we always hear is exponential. So what happens to those people who cannot find a job? This becomes the humanized factor. How do you skill them up? What does that look like? So there were very, very strong discussions about that. And that becomes very, very interesting in itself. So now you see an inverted triangle of a lot of issues, and that's why it's a moonshot. We have migration happening. We have all kinds of things in terms of what our world is looking like. We're learning other languages. We need to understand the geographies around us. There are cultural nuances all over. There are security implications, and with it comes privacy. We don't know enough. We have a chief privacy officer at Cisco, and she can tell you there's that intersectionality between law and what is private and security. It's a puzzle. And that's very interesting because we're now going to have a legal hackathon. That is, computer scientists who happen to be lawyers. Oh, what a concept. So, you interpret the law as you know it at the time you know it. Very interesting. You see now the interdisciplinary skills that are coming in. So, increased liberties. And so these are sort of the traits. Now let's look at where you're all engineers. You love that. Applaud, please. So I just painted you a picture of the trends. Now, digitization, we all talk about digitization, but we have to think about it from a private industry perspective. And I'm going to go up to the trends. Let's take you across the trends. People don't understand what's happening to them in the small and medium business environment. What does digitization mean? What are the skills that are required? Right? We think about it at Cisco all the time. And so do our customers, and so do our partners. In Germany, I'll give you an example, 75% of the small and medium enterprises are not prepared for a digitized society. They don't have the skill set. The global economy, as we know it, we have all kinds of factors that are happening today that are scenarios that we have to pay attention to. For example, I live on the other side of the environment, and what we see now, and you see it now in your own environment in the United States, I can say that I'm an American citizen, but you see a lot of problems, not only from how we measure GDP, what is GDP, what is that, are we measuring the right things, so know a little bit about economics, what are the political factors, and we can also talk about scenario analysis here. But what we're seeing is now a trend towards, what I see is a trend towards sort of isolationism, which we have to pay very careful attention to. Scarce resources. How many of you are from the Middle East? Water is so important. And I remember being served a glass of water, and it was like being served something so special. Because water is very important as a resource that we have. Let me challenge you, what we're seeing in our scenarios may be because of the resources. Water is very, very key. We've seen that before, water. That's an example. It's not just oil. When I talked with colleagues who are in the Middle East, They're trying to get people off of this oil economy and thinking about what needs to be done in textile, what needs to be done in private industry. And it's very, very challenging. You know, what does that look like? The other thing is the changing population. We have already touched upon that. But the changing population is big. And it's also exciting. It's great when I meet little kids and they're speaking foreign languages, before their mother tongue, right? Very interesting. And let me just take a step back. I live in a country that is 8.2 million people. That's Switzerland. And a teacher is remunerated as much as an engineer. Let me repeat that. A teacher is remunerated as much as an engineer. And why is that? Because the culture of the country is if I put my child in the hands of a stranger, I want that person to be well compensated. It's a different cultural bent, isn't it? Very interesting. Something we learn. And I also believe when you talk about community chartered, oriented individuals, I believe, as we heard yesterday from Coca-Cola, about purposeful, that which has a purpose. So think about it. Is this device made of, blood diamonds? Think about how you qualify your employees, the companies you work for, the companies you will start. What are going to be your values? Your core values, and how you qualify that. The ecosystem of your partners. How do you qualify that? Let me suggest to you, part of the qualification is how you treat people. How do you treat people? So you got people, purpose, participation, platform, and productivity. It's called quad Ps, right? So, and I think with that, you have to think about those values. The platform, that which you're going to create. What does participation look like? Is it a co-creation? Are we co-creating together? And then, of course, this hyper connective world that we live in. The new environments. And then we have something, how many of you have heard of blockchain? Oh, write it down. Oh, write it down, write it down. We talked about encryption yesterday. Let me suggest to you that your crypto keys are always going to be challenged. Look at blockchain today. We are looking at it. Think about a distributed chain of trust. Think about that. Think about what that will look like and how I qualify it. That it's peer-to-peer or distributed. So, and then of course you have identity. So I think one of the reasons why when we think of blockchain, we think about sort of this notion of cryptocurrency, which kind of goes hand in hand. But there's interesting things about that environment because it has a democratization view that we probably never thought of before. And that is, can we turn that off, please? That's really disturbing. More so for you than it is for me, because you can't hear me. Sounds like a dental drill, actually, which is really terrifying. Which is really terrifying. But let me take a step why blockchain. There's a book coming out that's come out by Dan Tascott and his son on the whole blockchain economy and what it could look like from a government perspective, from a enterprise perspective, etc. It's interesting to take a look at that, okay? Why are we talking about it today? It's this notion of trust. So, there is a great school called Code to Inspire. I think it's Code to Inspire. How many of you heard of Code to Inspire? Great. You know about Code, the girls in Afghanistan. There's also the girls in Afghanistan. What is happening here? Code to Inspire. These girls are actually trained to code. They're trained to blog. And there's no notion of PayPal. They're remunerated in cryptocurrency. they're remunerated in cryptocurrency. And think about the algorithm. I could actually start to now build an algorithm such that I would actually have a reputation to give them, a reputation on whether or not we could give them a loan, and so on and so forth. So there's this very interesting notion of what we're thinking about. And with it comes identity. Now, I pause on identity because I think we need to. When I was at the UN on May 20th, there were government interventions, and there were also private and civil interventions on this notion of identity. You have how many identity cards? You have a social security number, you may have a passport, you may have a student ID number, you may have a driver's license, you have something. You wake up one day and you don't have that. So they started out with this notion of Mina. How many of you have heard of the story of Mina? Mina was a film, actually it's a true story, it's a film that Lucy Liu actually documented. And Mina's a girl out of India, was born in a village, 9 years old, she is sold to a brothel. She has no identity. And by the time she was, I think, 15, she had 3 children. So how do you deal with human trafficking is the real question. How do you prove her identity? She was actually saved by one of the NGOs. This is the identity issue. And when time came when she wanted her children back, she couldn't prove that she couldn't prove who the father was. So those children are still stuck in the brothels. So how do you prove that? How do you solve for that? And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, probably two blocks away, you're having human trafficking problems today. In the United States, it's very common, more common than you think. The other part is, where are you from? Boston. He wakes up one morning, it's bombed, and it's bombed, it's a war. He has to leave. What do you leave with? You leave with something, but he can't prove that he graduated from a university. Right? So digital identity, and then there's the whole notion of what I choose to share, how I choose to share it with you. That's the proof case is, could I go through immigration here? They would have a notion of where I was from. They would. So we think you're from the United States. And could I board a Virgin Atlantic plane and pay in cryptocurrency? Now, big implication here is that you're challenging sovereign identity. That's really the big discussion people have been talking about. Is that so far off from reality? Ladies and gentlemen, take a look at Estonia. It's happening today. They're doing it. You can get an ID card from Estonia, and they're using blockchain. So lots of things to be able to think about in this world. The other notion is value creation. Whatever you do in your job, in your new careers, understand the notion of value. People will ask you, what is the value creation? What are you doing it for? Is it smarter services? Is this notion of X as a service and some notion of blockchaining in a platform? So you can see now the new models. When we talk about building a humanized internet, we're talking about it's your freedom. It's your basic freedom. It's your human right. I used to call this freedom as a service until somebody said, well, freedom is a human right. So it is your human right. And it's really your human right to do what you want, when you want, and how you want. The cards. And people are thinking about this problem. So here's another thing to look up. ID2020.org. ID2020.org. There's a whole Web of Trust GitHub environment. There's papers involved in this. We have designs that we're looking at. We are trying to solve today for the big, 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 big problems. So this is not ethereal, this is real, and we are inviting you to participate. The building blocks are what we could imagine the building blocks to be. They're all the basics, stuff that we care about. We care about our food, we care about water. If you have been disrupted in your lifetime, you're going to care all about that. About education. What happens when you are in a refugee camp? How do you learn? What does learning look like? Or, how do we disrupt learning today in the United States? What does that look like? Are the values, are what you're taking away from your school going to be valuable? I will argue yes. But pay attention to be able to change, because your career is not going to be linear. It will not be. So all kinds of stuff that we're thinking about. And by the way, on identity and reputation and blockchain, we're looking at it from a talent creation. Could I create a reputation system with you? Why would I work with you? What's your reputation look like? Could I award you? How would that reward look like? So what you see now is another deconstruction of the opportunity. It's how we disrupt learning. How are we going to consume what we're creating? What does on-demand look like? Finances. Think about finances. We have a colleague who's going to be presenting fairly soon on finances, but think about, now I have cryptocurrency. So could I continue with that, right? So the world is changing, ladies and gentlemen. The systems are being challenged. And you have a great opportunity to create something new. Something new. It's fantastic. I'm excited about it. And here's more of another way of looking at it. Sort of this notion of cognitive agents. So this notion of how we use blockchain, how I create a reputation system, how do I interact, and how do I interact such that people are absolutely involved, right? The people, we call it empathetic engineering, human engineering. It's funny, human factors, right? Think about the person who's involved. What about my proof of survival? We talked about this a little bit earlier, but this notion about digital identity, that I could actually have a global identity, that I choose to share that identity when I share it. That you have now something like an Airbnb for refugees, when you think about their stories. And by the way, we've had refugee hackathons. When you think about their stories and the family, and how, what are they looking for? What's happening as you're crossing the desert or you're crossing the ocean? What is happening? What does my identity look like? Could I have a proof of survival? Clean water and medicine, what are the basics? These are the basics. And that's one side of the house, but let me suggest that I could have that anyway, today. Today. Stuff that we're thinking about now. And the other notion is, what about the human trafficking problem? And those are big numbers, ladies and gentlemen. How do we now solve for those numbers? And if that isn't a shock for you, it should be. Because it's not just happening outside the States, it's happening here. So we need to look at how do we now have a platform that's actually tracking, helping you have that identity, rather than a tattoo that says you work in a brothel 2 streets down, right? And you were forced to. So, something to absolutely challenge you by. Drones. This is a harder problem. But you have to think about the use of drones in a way that we can care. What could we bring if you were in an emergency situation? It's a much difficult problem, but an interesting opportunity for us. That we send care packages in. Medicine is a very big challenge, because I've talked to somebody about that. You have to look at how that gets carried in, but think about it. The drones for providing material, for absolutely tracking people, to absolutely get them rescued and mapped, and get them on board, and help them. And this is just an example for getting the food and water, and by the way, education. And I'm coming to conclusion. Let me suggest to you that solving a billion people problem is going to take the following ingredients. Gender equality is one, and the reason why we mention that is, how many of you are familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals? There are 17 of them. Thank you very much. Homework is to be familiar with them, right? Number 1 is end poverty. Number 5 is gender equality. In a world of 7.3 billion people, 51% of the population happen to be women. And so we need to think about how do you actually, when you're engineering, how are you mapping your solution to those SDG goals. It's something to think about. How do we create, this is the story, simplification of travel? I share with you what I choose to share with you. What does a digital ID look like? We have examples. Estonia is an example. Please pay attention to your privacy. Here's what happened in the UN event on May 20th. Somebody asked the question, what would happen if a dictator got a hold of Facebook? Think about that. What would happen if you were in World War II in Nazi Germany if Joseph Goebbels got a hold of Facebook? Think about that. So it's a little dicey here, right? What about our environment? We care about that. Water. There's this whole notion of how we simplify the system in taxes. By the way, I will say to you, living abroad is interesting for me because the United States is the only government next to a trio that double taxes its citizens. Access to health care is absolutely important, and that's just the way it is for people who are in dire need, but for everybody, And then, of course, technology access and education, and how we disrupt education. On the technology, I had a technical meetup at the school. We have a refugee digital, there's a school in Berlin. We didn't know much about the backgrounds of the people. Some of them live in Tempelhof Airport in the dorms. But what they do, they get up and they learn German. That's their day. They learn German because they have to integrate, number one. Number two is they learn to code. So when we had the technical meetup, they were really technical. They were pushing the boundaries on the technical discussion. In fact, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, visited the same school 3 weeks later. And what we're doing is hiring them at Cisco as fully paid interns. And on the other hand, for people who are unemployed, looking at how we skill up the unemployed together. What do the skills look like? Now, here's the thing. I hope I have challenged you to solve for these billion people problems. I hope that you believe it's a moonshot and that together we can do that. And I mean that together because it's in beta and we need you. Thank you.
Monique, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I can hold this, sir. Thank you. Monique, you shared with us, as you were describing, in terms of the challenges, the need to bring in perspectives. And I was wondering if you might give us some thoughts. How do we go about bringing people with those different perspectives into our teams to work in this way that you're describing?
I think, so that's a great question. I think we have to build, and this was a question from yesterday too, and how do you build different teams? From the very start, you have to think about bringing in different mindsets. I mean, that's the way I do. I mean, this is the way we have to look at that. And I will say that if you are not reflective of the society you're in, then you have a problem. If your group and teams are not reflective of that society, you have a problem. And so that's one area. I think I'm looking at this audience today, beyond the glare. And believe you, I was going to wear sunglasses.
Bring the lights, if we could have the lights.
But I'm looking at this audience today, and I think I am very optimistic. I mean, this is an example of looking and challenging and having those teams brought in, you know, on a very, very proactive basis. Let me take a step back. On April 11th, I was at an event at Yale University, and there's a business ethics class. Anybody from Yale here? There's a business ethics class. It's an undergraduate class. It's very oversubscribed. Its teacher is a futurist. His name is Vikram. And these students come from various backgrounds all over the world. They come from various disciplines. They are engineers. They're computer scientists. They are poli-sci students or whatever. And they're looking at solving very interesting problems, one of whom is actually an ambassador. He's a Fulbright scholar now. To a government on climate change. And one person who actually is building his company, he's from the Philippines, a very poor family, but he's building a company on the values that he subscribes to. That's an example. Any other questions?
There are so many questions, so I want to
Please.
take that privilege one more. I want to ask if we can, just a question, it's not a question, it's a request, to have the lights turned on, so that way we can invite questions as well. from our participants here. Someone could come open up the lights, that would be great. So another question, Guru and I were talking about this many times, what you don't learn in school, in undergraduate school, in engineering school, in graduate school. There's so many things that really don't learn in school. And so when you look at all the things you gave us leads today, many leads of things that are happening, that are affecting us in the present, that are going to affect us in the future. So that's a starting point. In addition to those leads that you gave us and the homework that you suggested we undertake, and the challenges that you outlined, what are ways, from your perspective, that you might go yourself personally, or that you see in your organization, to go about getting access to those skills and to learn? There's so many ways it could be. What are some thoughts that you might have?
So learning is lifelong for me. It is predicted that, I don't know, you can look up the source that you're going to learn something every 5 years. You have to. It doesn't stop when you get out of college. I mean, and your career is not going to be linear, ladies and gentlemen. Oh my God, mine isn't. Mine wasn't. So there's this responsibility. You are responsible for learning something. Pick your favorite language. It doesn't have to be, it's a programming language, maybe, Ruby on Rails or whatever, Python. That's a given. Pick your favorite foreign language, please. That's a must. Those are musts, 2 musts. So you have to, think about that. The other area that I think is very, very important is that I know a lady named Elizabeth Zell. She's from Babson College, and she's looking at the whole notion of ageism. She's trying to remove the word retire from your language. So what does that mean? You're going to have multi-generational teaming. I'm going to be working for you. I'm going to be working for you. And it doesn't matter. You have to get used to that. Interdisciplinary skills. So that's really, really, really key.
This is great. Thank you. So is there a question?
Please.
Please. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Hi, I'm Ayush from the Houston section. My question is more around when you're engaging these big billion problems, how at Cisco, or generally in your opinion with corporations, do you justify the investment from, who's going to pay for these services when you're trying to ID these billion people? Is it a government initiated, how will you get return for investors through these initiatives?
So I'm looking at the other side, the humanitarian use of technology. You've got the other side that's looking at, immediate investments, right? So here you're looking at social responsibility, the social responsibility team with whom we work at Cisco. I mean, they're in Jordan, they're in other countries. We work very, very, very much together. And we work together with the government. So what's on top? So the dialogue starts this way. What's on the top of a government's official's mind? What's their top of mind? So it may be having a digital ID. In India, there's been a great progress in that direction. As an example, most of the discussion is about jobs and the skills required to get jobs. So those are the top, and that starts there. So we start with that, and we're in that space already. So let me suggest to you, how many of you have heard of Game Changers 500? Talk about value. Index. Take a look at that. This is for-profit, social responsible companies. And look at who's in the Game Changer 100. Look at who's in the Game Changer. So I will say that's the new currency of the 21st century. Good.
Thank you. And a question?
Hi, Chris Miller from Metro Los Angeles. I have a very broad question for you. Can the internet or technology in general be inherently apolitical? And if not, then how, as technology leaders, do we deal with the political implications of the technology that we develop?
Fantastic question. Thank you very, very much. It's built to be apolitical. It has to be apolitical. But on the other hand, I say but, because I'm on the other side of the house when I see tech policy. There are governments that are starting to, they have been for some time, co-opting the use of the internet. And so what you have, when I say that, you have parts and parts of the internet or services that are being blocked. And so you have to look at how you kind of negotiate very, very carefully. So we will argue, and this is the thing about the wonderful internet, is it's apolitical, and And we also believe, this is the other thing, is when we go into Africa as an example, we do a lot of capacity building with governments. We also talked about maybe in some of the governments this need, like we have Megan Smith, to have sort of a CTO or a geek in residence with a government official, sort of because there needs to be kind of that advocacy. But you know, it's a really very fine line, and we don't take a political stance. It's the internet with a capital I. Now, having said that, when I'm in a UN event and I have members of the Russian Federation or whatever federation, whatever, what will happen is people will raise their hand and say, well, you know, this was something that was created as a defense experiment in the United States, right? So they kind of go back and forth. So you have to wear, and this is the other thing, diplomatic lens on. And so when I'm in those events, I'm part of the U.S. delegation. But it's got to be apolitical. That's the only way we look at it when we think about that internet. We do challenge. We do challenge for the bigger problems, and that's what gets a government's ears. We've had solution summits at the UN in New York, coming from all parts of the world, and it's phenomenal what solutions we see. And that's what we have to advocate towards, and say, this is why there's a value of the internet. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we'll bring these two questions as well in.
So my question was for all of us in the crowd that are young, starting our career, what are your thoughts on going sort of into a bigger company and doing entrepreneurial efforts into using those resources to affect change versus the entrepreneurial route and starting our own smaller companies to be leaner and hopefully maybe faster or something?
Come on in. No, I mean, so here's why I say entrepreneur. It's a mindset in that sense, and especially in established corporates. It is about changing that mindset of what was probably built on 30 or 40 years ago. We have to change it to be even more nimble, more quicker, and to think about out of the, I don't like to think about boxes, but really challenging, pushing the boundary, and challenging the status quo. That's what we all have to do, is challenge that status quo. Just because you're taught in a certain way doesn't mean you may be taught to think. Great, think. But think about the bigger problems that you can solve first.
Monique, maybe on this question, what's interesting, you had brought up one of the essential elements about value and how organizations consider how do they go about creating the value as well as getting the benefit of value for the customer and for the organization.
So whatever you do, we think of as engineers, everything you'll be challenged about value. What's the value to the company? What's the value to society? What's the value creation? People talk in terms of return on investment. Sometimes you may not know that return on investment. When I think about the internet, did they talk about that? They just did it, right? So that's something we have to think, we have to really take a pause on and look at it from another lens. It's great that we have a business lens on it. The other part of it is hyper innovation. When I say hyper, we're talking about I'll go to London, we'll rally around a problem, in 48 hours we have a prototype. Just have the tools to do it. That's the type of direction we're going to. And the other point is, remember, a CEO has the attention span of 3 lines, 3 sentences. I kid you not, 3. And 30-second voicemail. 30-second voicemail. They want to feel what it is you're going to show them. If you can come in and say, this is what I'm doing, this is the value, and here's how you experience it, kudos. Fantastic. Make sense? Great.
Thank you.
Abdul Rahman's IEEE Seattle section. I read a book a couple of months ago by Chris Ducker on virtual freedom. In that book, Chris talks about the value that people all over the world, if small businesses and medium businesses and startups can tap into the talent all over the world, it could bring in a lot of value. But that's outsourcing, right? There's a stigma of outsourcing today, especially in the U.S. What are your comments on that? Is there a future for it?
There is a future in terms of looking outside your company and building an ecosystem of players. So we all do that. General Electric does it. We all do it. IBM. A lot of our companies do that, to look at We even have contests around that. So that's a way to look at it. But let me suggest to you another challenge to your question. Let me suggest another way to think about the economy, another way to think about corporations is what would it look like that the corporation of the future consists only of a CIO and CEO. And I only contract you on a project-by-project basis. Think about that. For 1 minute, is that possible? Would we be thinking about it? People will say, well, what about IPR? And we would have to think, what about intellectual property? What about that? So you have to think about the analog. The answer is we go out wide to the industry. It's not necessarily outside. We look at wide variety of players, no matter where they're at in the world, especially if you're a multi-global. You cannot claim to be a multi-global company if you're not looking outside where you live. And given the scenarios that we have to think about that.
Thank you. This is great. I would stay on the stage all day. I do have one more question that I have to ask you while we're here. Before I do that, I just wanted to make an addition. We did say that at this conference we're going to start building things. I didn't think our intention was to actually get the building started above us. So there has been we also need the space to think. So we're being adaptive. But yeah, I feel like while you're here on stage with us, and we have here really a brain trust of IEEE, and as an IEEE member, and the part of our leadership team that's here. Did you have any thoughts on the intersection, sort of the things that we've been talking about for our organization as a network, as a service, in all the analogies that you have? What's something that you'd like to see come forward from this meeting today that will affect our profession?
So first of all, I want to thank IEEE Young Leaders. I am an IEEE member, so I've stated that. I see huge value. Senior, I'm knocking at the door of fellow, so senior. And so it's huge value of IEEE. So I want to say that from the very, very start, as young members, young professionals, we need you. We absolutely need you. And if we've heard about lessons to learn in your career early. We talked about actually pushing the boundary and understanding the world around you. I would like to suggest that we can work on building and solving for these great billion people problems. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And not only hearing from you, I'm looking forward to seeing your prototypes. That's a challenge.
So great, we're on it.
All right.
Thanks, Monique.
You bet.
Thanks so much.